Well, hello, Andrew again, and this is episode 44. Today we're looking at Matthew 12, verses 43 to 45. When the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, this is Jesus speaking, it wanders through waterless regions looking for a resting place, but it finds none. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came. When it comes, it finds it empty, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and brings along 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they enter and live there. And the last state of that person is worse than the first. So it will be also with this evil generation. Well, this passage is the final bookend to the section in this gospel, starting with the healing of the demoniac in verse 14, which we've been spending pretty well the last week on. Though it could be argued it actually starts in verse 1 of the chapter, where the Pharisees attack Jesus for allowing his disciples to wander through the fields on the Sabbath and help themselves to heads of grain. It does, though, draw the section on the demonic possession to a close. Well, for now anyway. I was actually unclear as to where I was going to go with this. It became clear to me, though, eventually that the key phrase, to me anyway, is the very last one. So it will be also with this evil generation. And it then required me to go back and look at what actually about it is that makes this particular generation evil. It's become clear, as we've been reading through chapter 12, that the religious leaders are defined by what they're against. They are concerned that all appearance of sin be removed. People have to be aligning their lives and not doing the things they're not supposed to be doing. The people live without sinning, living strictly according to the thou shalt nots of the legal code. Well, what I know is that this is hard work. It takes a huge amount of willpower and psychic energy and eternal vigilance to be focused on all the things one has to avoid, one has to not do. And the problem is that the more illicit they seem to be, the more effort is required, it would seem, to not do them. And the goal, presumably, is holiness. The problem is that holiness is not defined by what we don't do, by our simply obeying the thou shalt nots. And the more we become obsessed with this sort of holiness, the harder it becomes to keep. We discover how duplicitous our hearts are, how sneaky, how deceitful, in their willingness into tricking us into doing things we're studiously trying to avoid. Or maybe it's just me. The price of such holiness is, as I said, eternal vigilance. And that makes it an impossible task and totally exhausting. So, we've achieved it for now. The house is swept clean. It all looks good for now. And when the exhaustion claims us, or the boredom claims us, or the depression and anxiety claim us, we ask ourselves, is this life in its fullness? It clearly is not. And we deserve a break. We have done so well. We deserve some respite. Like sticking to a strict diet for 5 weeks, we deserve a trip to McDonald's. Ring any bells for anybody? Many gambling addicts have been forced to suspend the feeding of their addictions for the past 5 weeks, as the opportunities have been denied them because of the lockdown. What happens though when everything opens up again? Well, that depends. The likelihood is that they'll return to the pokies and whatever it is that they get their jollies from with a vengeance, needing to make up for lost time. The demons return, bringing a whole troop of others with them. Their condition is worse now than before. So, where does the answer lie? We've tried so hard to not live according to the flesh. On its own, it doesn't work. It's not enough. It will end in failure, possibly catastrophic failure. More than being emptied, the house needs to be filled with new life. It needs to be focused on and directed, I'd want to suggest, by Christ, the surest antidote. Paul in Colossians 3 puts it this way: since you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. It's when we live under this we discover that, as Paul affirms in Romans 8, the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set us free from the law of sin and death. E. Stanley Jones, who I'm engaging with again, probably for the fourth time on his book In Christ, helpfully testifies that the higher law, the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus, trumps the lower law, the law of sin and death. It's when we align ourselves with the higher law that we discover victory over the lower. We don't find victory by trying to squash out the lower law. We won't. It will claim us every time. See, there's a kind of displacement going on here. The more we orient our lives toward Christ, allowing Christ to fill us, Christ to guide us, Christ to love, to cleanse, to heal, to fill, to renew us, the lesser pull, the lower law, the law of sin and death, is able to exert. Rather than focusing on cleaning ourselves up first, imagining that we need to get ourselves sorted before we seek Christ, it makes sense to choose Christ first. Seek Christ's help, Christ's strength, and Christ's purpose in our lives. There are simple disciplines that we can engage in that will help us, and I'm not going through a list of them today. But the whole point of spiritual disciplines is to open us to the life of God. The disciplines are not an end in themselves. They are simply a pathway to help us encounter God. Part of our difficulty is that the contemporary church, the church of 2020, is a little different from the church that Jesus was addressing. All of us are trying to be good by avoiding certain behaviours. We are also identified, certainly in the public mind, by what we're against, by what we're opposed to, by what we imagine is destroying our society and our culture, although some of them may not be helping. But just as it was in the times of Jesus, the invitation is still the same. And I think we read it in Micah 6 and 8, right back in the Old Testament. He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. I actually think that's a pretty good summation. Nothing really has changed. As Jesus summarized the whole of the law, we are to love the Lord our God with all our hearts, with all our minds, with all our soul, with all our strength, and to love our neighbours as ourselves. You see, these are positive displacement activities that as we seek to engage in them, the other issues which we struggle against will kind of fade and become of much lesser significance. Well, I hope this is helpful. God bless you as you head off into another week.